BFO is an attempt to create a single framework which can deal with very many of the things that we've talked about already in one way or another in one single and rather simple ontology. There are 34 nodes in BFO, and you would think it would be simple to maintain an ontology with only 34 nodes, but actually it's almost a full-time job. So we deal with universals and particulars, which we've talked about. We deal with taxonomies, that it is our relation. So every ontology should have a backbone taxonomy, which should be a true hierarchy, and the nodes should be connected by is our relation. That's every reference ontology. Then there are part relations. There are connectedness, boundary relations, which we haven't talked about much. And then there are dependence relations, which we'll be talking about next. And there are 2 or 3 other things in BFO, but that's the main summary. And all of this came from various aspects of philosophy originally, and then application of philosophy to artificial intelligence and to geographic information science, and from the FMA, which was a big inspiration also. And the biggest inspiration was a meeting in 2004 in Leipzig, which I organized. So I had won an award from the German government to set up an institute on medical ontology. And so I started work in my new institute. I had 19 people working for me. And somebody, by accident, said, "Oh, what do you think of the gene ontology?" And I had never heard of the gene ontology. So I looked at it and realized, A, that this was the answer to the Maiden's Prayer. So it really was fantastic. But B, it was full of the nonsense, because they didn't know how to write definitions. So I invited the leaders of the gene ontology to come to my institute in Leipzig, pointing out all the absurdities. And they saw immediately that I was right, because they were obvious absurdities. And so I got to exert a certain influence on the logic of what they were doing. My talk was called STOP. The gene ontology acronym is GO. An example, a lytic vacuole within a protein storage vacuole is a term in the gene ontology. And they had the ISA relation. A lytic vacuole within a protein storage vacuole is a protein storage vacuole, which is just obviously wrong. Extrinsic to membrane is part of membrane. And in the early documentation of the gene ontology, they distinguished 4 meanings of the term part of. It can mean maybe part of. It can mean is at times part of. It can mean is included as a sublist in. And the 4th meaning was there is no relation at all between the part and the whole. And when they say sublist, every term in the Go is a gene ontology. Gene ontology is the root, which is the most beautiful example of the use-mention confusion you can think of. I published papers showing why they were wrong, and then they asked me to rebuild the logic, and that's how BFO came into being. So the gene ontology consists of 3 ontologies, one for parts of cells, one for the functions of molecules, and one for all biological processes downstream from the functioning of molecular functions. And this means that there are, as I put it, 2 ways of existing in time, either as a continuant when you continue or as an occurrent when you occur. And so I divided the gene ontology like this, and then I created BFO. Then people, including me, started extending the Go. They'd already done that for some things. They started extending it further, and they started using BFO then as the vehicle to make sure that all of these new ontologies would remain conformant to the gene ontology. And we created the Fiat Boundary, which is described in this paper, and which I will talk about next week. So today I'm just going to talk about BFO. It's meant to be very small. It's meant to be a true top-level ontology, so it doesn't contain anything else except the most excruciatingly boring parts of ontology. There's no mathematics for complicated reasons. I mean, we don't have anything under which number would fall. But we do have mathematical data, so we have measurement data. In other words, we were and still are actually primarily interested in supporting scientific data management. BFO is being used now by a lot of other people who are not doing or supporting science, but still the primary target audience for BFO is for information-driven science, and particularly life science. And we stay small by resisting efforts to incorporate domain ontology terms, which means terms which are restricted to one or the other domain, such as life, which is obviously a very small domain compared to the whole universe, and keep it so that BFO contains only terms which can be applied to every domain you can think of, whether it's philately or nuclear physics or cancer biology. Now, there are other top-level ontologies in this sense. Dolce is another one maintained by Italians, which is not necessarily a bad thing, as I repeatedly insist. There's something called the suggested upper-merged ontology, which is very sophisticated. Part of it actually was written by me a long time ago. It's very nice to explore. Anyone who knows what WordNet is will find WordNet reproduced in ontological form in Sumo. But it's full of domain ontology content, and the problem is that that domain ontology content would not be acceptable to an expert in the corresponding domains. And so for the purposes of BFO, which is to promote interoperability across many domain ontologies, Sumo failed. It has its other advantages, but it fails as a top-level ontology. We have three dichotomies. The continuant occurrent dichotomy. We've already talked about instances, so everything in BFO is on the level of universals. But the instances are always hanging around underneath. And if you're doing an ontology project, I recommend that you split the screen into two and have some examples of instances down here, and then have instance of relations connecting the two halves of your screen. You'll find that that's a good discipline, and it makes what you're doing clearer to the audience. So we have universals and instances, we have continuance and occurrence, and then we have dependent continuance. So we have a relation of dependence, and I'll explain what that means in a minute. First of all, we have specifically dependent continuance. They are things like qualities, and then, on the other hand, functions, roles, and dispositions. Qualities are things like height, length, weight, specific gravity, temperature, and so on. They are things you can measure, things which obtain of the thing independently of what it does. They're just ways it is at any given time. Realizable dependent continuants are dependent continuants which have to be performed or executed or realized, which is why they're called realizables. And I'll talk about those in a minute. So specific dependence means that any instance of this requires some instance of this in order to exist. So you can't have a headache without a head. You can't have a color without having some kind of a surface. You can't have a temperature without having a body which has that temperature. So temperature, weight, and so on are all specifically dependent on some independent continuant bearer. Independent continuant means that it's something which is not itself dependent on something else. It's just there. So people, planets, ping pong balls, all organisms, all cells, all organs, they're all independent continuants. And then what we measure is usually a non-realizable dependent continuant. And they are the relations of dependence. So a process of realizing a disposition is dependent on the disposition, and the disposition is dependent on the bearer of the disposition, and the process is dependent on the bearer of the disposition. So we have all of those dependence relations. And again, just as for part of, so also for dependence, we have dependence on the instance level. My headache is necessarily such that if I cease to exist, then my headache ceases to exist. That's about me and my headache. And then on the type level, the universal headache specifically depends on the universal head, let's say, means that for every instance of headache, there is some head which is such that the headache depends on, which means requires specifically, that head in order to exist. That was, it takes a long time to say it, but it's actually boring. It's so trivial that we shouldn't have to say it. So then we have qualities are, for instance, the whiteness of the cheese. Then we have roles. Roles are realizables in the sense that if you have a role, that means that you can perform the role in certain ways. You can realize the role. So if you have the nurse role, you can perform it by doing the nurse things. If you have a lecturer role, you can perform that role by lecturing. And now the key difference between, so roles are always optional. They do not depend upon any physical characteristic of the role holder. They depend upon employment contracts and things like that. But dispositions are tendencies or potentials that things have because of the way they are made physically. So the disposition to go bald of adult males depends upon the chemistry of the head. And the disposition to grow old depends upon the chemistry and biology of the whole body. So roles are realizable dependent continuants, which are dependent upon external forces, such as employers who tell you what role you're going to play, where dispositions are dependent upon internal forces, the physics of the bearer. Dispositions are the area where BFO talks about what is possible rather than what is actual. All right, now go back to qualities for a minute. This is the four-category ontology I referred to earlier. We have instances along the bottom and universals along the top, and we have the particular redness here, the quality of a particular I here, and this particular instantiates this universal, and this particular instantiates this universal. And we can then add another layer. Red is a sub-universal of the universal color, and I is a sub-universal of the universal anatomical structure. And then we can infer that if this instance of I instantiates the universal I, it also instantiates the universal anatomical structure. And now for those of you who are embroiled in the database world, which is another area where I know nothing, they have non-instantiated or abstract classes, which are classes with no instances. In ontology, all classes have instances because they inherit all the instances from their subclasses. And so we don't need to talk about that. I want to talk about functions because that's the new stuff. So realizable dependent continuants are things like plans, functions, roles, disposition, capabilities, tendencies. And they get executed or performed or exercised or applied. And so we don't need that. I already said that. Now we get to disposition. Disposition is an internally grounded realizable entity. It's specifically dependent, which means that if it ceases to exist, then that's because its bearer is physically changed. So it can't exist without this bearer. And it means that being a disposition means that its realization occurs when the bearer is in some special physical circumstances, and it occurs in virtue of the bearer's physical makeup. So if I cough in a certain environment, that's because I have a disposition to cough in an environment like that. If I go bald as I age, then that's because I have a disposition to realize the disposition to go bald by going bald. So this is not rocket science either. And now a function is a special kind of disposition. A function is a disposition somebody has which is such that having that disposition is the reason why that thing exists. So the function of the screwdriver is to communicate torque to a screw. Why is that? That's certainly a disposition. Why is it a function? Because the screwdriver exists for that reason. That's why we made the screwdriver, because we wanted to communicate torque to a screw. Why does the heart exist? Because we needed something to pump blood. Our ancestors, who were the first of our ancestors to have hearts, and don't ask me to describe that in more detail, needed something to pump blood, and they had something that could do that slightly more successfully than their neighbors, and so they had more surviving offspring who had these special heart-like precursors, and then the ones of those whose heart-like precursor was even better at pumping blood than all the others would again have more offspring until eventually we had hearts. So we have hearts because we needed to select for a blood pumping vehicle. And that's why we say the heart function of the heart is to pump blood, because hearts were selected to pump blood. Screwdrivers were selected to screw screws. And functions are those dispositions which were designed or selected for. That's just a definition. If you think you can do better, then I gladly yield. Now we have a question. And now I'm doing some thinking, so this is not finished product yet. We have functions: the function of the heart, the function of the screwdriver, the function of the steering wheel, the function of the legs, function of the nose, and so on. And of course, many of these things will have multiple functions. I want to claim that every function along that list and a much longer list is such that its realization can be good or less good. Now that's not true of all dispositions by any means. So I claim it's true of all functions. Can anyone think, and I just have a footnote which we'll come to in a minute. Organisms, I think, and humans certainly do not have functions. It is not my function to do ontology. It's what I do most of the time, but it's not my function. Where it is the function of the screwdriver to screw screws. So, are there functions which are not gradable on a good or less good realization scale? So pumping of the heart, there are diseased hearts and there are healthy hearts. They're graded on a scale. Screwdrivers, there are some really bad screwdrivers that you can buy for 15 cents. And then there are good screwdrivers. So, are there any examples of functions which you can't grade as being good or less good? I'm really keen to learn of such examples.
But maybe a bad example, because the appendix may have, it may be a reservoir for the microbiome for your digestive system.
Yes, so
there may be functions that are not elaborated yet.
Exactly. So it is deemed as redundant, but the functions of all the functions of appendix has not been realized.
Okay, so when you say elaborated and when you say realized, do you mean have become known to?
Known to.
Yeah, I'm not interested in that. That's not ontology, that's just knowledge.
Some functions maybe that are binary.
Binary?
Either does it or doesn't.
Good,
like it's
good.
either on or it's
That
not.
would be an interesting kind of case. So can you think of one?
So like maybe the function of some material is to permit the flow of electrons.
Yeah.
Either does or it doesn't. Like something that just doesn't do that, just doesn't have.
It doesn't sound very convincing.
If it doesn't have that property,
the example's
it
not
doesn't have
very
that
good.
function.
Flow of electrons, when you talk about something like flow, that's gradable as better or worse, more or less.
Yes. So some silicon, I imagine, is purer and more effective to be used as a diode than some other sort. But
is binary not gradable? I mean, it's gradable, it's just there's two values of it, so...
Yes, but I haven't heard a clear example of binary yet.
What about like a memory register?
Yep, I was just going to say it. A chip.
Like if you have a stored value in a memory register, but it's corrupted by radiation, it's either working or not working.
Oh, that's what you think. No, I think they're going to be states between working and not working well and not working at all, where it has a 93% reliability, or it's rusting.
But I mean, if you have a satellite, you can have like one or two, or one corrupted register, and then its entire routine will fail.
Yes, but
You could say there's 1% of the registers
No, but
are
that
failed. Right?
that can be
Well, I
like
mean, if it
coronary
crashes,
artery
then-
disease, where some of the blood vessels are not working because there is ischemia, and
okay, but you have
there is
to agree
partial blockage.
that, okay, then you have a scale.
Yes, there is
So
a scale.
Scale is exactly what I'm claiming is universal. Now, the binary cases, I think, are all of the ones I've heard go hand in hand with that there being a little bit of a departure from good working, and then a lot of departure from good working, and then not working at all. Someone says, I want an impermeable membrane, and they only care about whether it's completely impermeable or whether it lets anything through. But actually, there are going to be a whole series of places along the scale. They're only concerned with the first flip, if you like. So that binariness flows from the expectations of the user, not from the way the thing itself functions. And binariness of a light switch won't work because we all know that light switches can be a bit unreliable after a time. I said organisms never have functions, and I'm certainly willing to argue strongly that people never have functions. I'm not sure about some bacteria which have been designed particularly to break down oil spills or something, but people never have functions, but people do have capabilities. And now what I want to do is define capability. A capability, a skill, for instance, is a special kind of disposition. First of all, I want to say that the only things which have capabilities are things which either are people or are made by people. And maybe organisms in general have capabilities. A cat has a capability to sniff out mice. But anyway, these kinds of things have capabilities. Can mountains have capabilities? Can anything outside the organic realm have a capability?
A question. When you mean organisms, also parts of the organisms too, like cells?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And I should add that. And every function is a capability, and every capability is a disposition. This is what I want to end up with. And the problem then is to find what is the specific difference among dispositions which makes them capabilities, and what is the specific difference among capabilities which makes them functions. This we understand. Functions are capabilities which are such that their bearer has as the reason for its existence that it has this capability. So the heart has the function of pumping blood because it has the capability of pumping blood, and it exists for that reason. People have lots of capabilities, they don't have any functions. Capabilities are more than just dispositions, they are special dispositions. What makes them special? They can be graded along an axis of good and bad.
So, in your axis of good and bad, somebody has different capabilities to metabolize alcohol.
Yeah.
So it depends on the person's perspective whether metabolizing slowly
Or you could just use the
alcohol
Star Wars,
is a good thing, or metabolizing faster is a good thing.
Okay, so I think that's two capabilities. There is the capability to metabolize alcohol time neutrally, as it were. And then there is the capability of metabolizing quickly, that would be yet another capability.
There are folks that metabolize alcohol very quickly, and it doesn't have as much effect as other individuals who metabolize it very slowly and much longer. There is some social effects with this too.
Okay. So I think that actually what you're saying is sort of supporting my view, because it's clear that capability of metabolizing alcohol as instantiating in different people can be graded on a scale.
Can be, yes. But whether which end is good or bad can be switched.
I don't think I'm too worried about it.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes?
So you want an example of a capability that's not for an organism, basically, right? So
Yes,
what about just the?
That's the next question. Can there be a capability which is not of one of these kinds of entities?
What about the capability of an object to support a certain amount of weight? So certain kinds of rocks can, or withstand certain kinds of blows, or those kinds of
I believe that we would
transmit
you're
electricity.
moving into the realm of artifacts. So if we are building a dam protection rock pile.
Well, it's relevant there, but it's also relevant. It's also relevant for if you want to figure out if the shoreline is going to fall into the ocean. If you should build a house there.
I think that you've made the shoreline into a human artifact.
Is that really a disposition of the shoreline? That it's
to collapse into the water.
Like the disposition of your teeth to withstand acid erosion.
You have a sandy shore, a limestone shore, or a granite.
And that means
shore.
we can just kind of proliferate dispositions based upon their ability not to do something. So my
No, it's stronger than that. You're right that there is a danger of proliferation of dispositions, but the way we keep that proliferation under control is by saying that only those dispositions which are treated of by scientists or by product designers are the real ones. So that you have the disposition to nod your head when you agree. You also have the disposition to nod your head and fold your arms. You also have the disposition to nod your head and do that. So you have lots of dispositions. But you also have the disposition to nod your head and fold your arms and not brush your hair and not fiddle with your shoulder. You have thousands of those dispositions, but of course not all of them are worth being cataloged. Just random combinations of other ones, or the absence of other ones. I think that you just turned the shoreline into a human artifact. I think that we wouldn't think about that if we were thinking about storms on Mars. That we wouldn't see that as a capability of this particular ravine to withstand Martian sandstorms. It's because we're treating the shoreline as realistic, which is a human artifact. That's why Mars is so important. There can be no capabilities on Mars.
That's a great title for a paper.
So it doesn't make sense to say that a certain habitat has the capability to support life.
Artifact created by organisms, beaver dams and things are artifacts.
The celestial bodies or planets having gravity or capability to attract other mass.
We don't talk like that. We don't say the sun is doing a really good job today.
Well, that wouldn't be that wouldn't be graded, would it? That would be like gravity attraction would be just a disposition, not graded. The attraction of gravity would just be a disposition. It's not graded.
Yeah. There are lots of dispositions on Mars. When we have space tourism, we will be describing even Mars as having cruise vessels.
Just wait till we find aliens.
All right, so I am still enamored of this definition. Capability is a disposition that an entity has, I want to say, whose performance can be evaluated along a scale of more or less good. Now, I think that that is true for human capabilities. All skills are like that. I don't know if any of you know somebody called Peter Koch, who was a PhD student here recently. He wrote his dissertation on capabilities using BFO. So this is his idea in large part. As a basis for understanding what doctors are trying to do when they try to cure patients' diseases. They're not always trying to keep them alive, because you might keep them alive but destroy all their capability or realization possibility. So preserving patient welfare is what doctors are trying to do, and welfare you can define in terms of capability. So this is a picture of the nodes in BFO. All the terms in BFO are on the screen now. It's also a picture of all the ISA relations between all of those nodes. Now, there are various other relations between the nodes. For instance, every Fiat object part is part of some material entity. And they are captured in the axioms for BFO. Now, we have a documentation of BFO at the GitHub site, which is an English documentation with semi-formal statements of the axioms. So we use words and letters for universals or for instances, but the axioms are documented in real English sentences. We also have an OWL formalization of BFO, which you can also find at the GitHub site, and a common logic version of BFO, which you can request if you wish. A common logic is much more expressive than OWL, which means that for some purposes it's easier to read. The problem is that it's more difficult to use it in a computational context because it's first-order logic, and first-order logic is not decidable. But anyone who is interested in seeing the common logic axiomatization of BFO can contact me. We're going to go through this diagram and just draw out certain features so that you'll get a better idea of what we are attempting to achieve here. There are entities. Entity is really just a dummy name. It's an umbrella to catch everything. And then we divide entities into two, namely continuance and occurrence, and you've seen how that works already a week ago. And now if we move down, immediately below independent continuant is material entity. Now, material entities in rough and ready terms are everything which has molecules as parts. But one day we are going to need to investigate smaller material entities. At the moment, we don't have very many people in physics who are using BFO, but there will come a time when the demands from physicists will enforce a much more careful consideration of what material entities are and of what related physical terms stand for in the BFO context, like force and momentum and energy and so forth. So we are thinking about those questions, but we are not, it's not a priority. It will become a priority at one stage. Now, there are three distinct kinds of material entity distinguished by BFO. And as I've emphasized, BFO does not claim to be complete. So there are other kinds of material entity too. I could even name some if anybody is interested. But these are the three which we recommend people use. First of all, there are objects. Objects are material entities which have their own continuous boundaries. An example of a boundary would be your skin or the surface of your body. Another example of a boundary would be the, I'm trying to find an object. So this is an object. The plastic covering of this pen. It may be two objects. That's one of the questions that we will have to address. This pencil is much more clearly one object, and here we have a heterogeneous covering made of the surface of the graphite together with the surface of the wood here, and then the paint surface and the rubber surface here. In fact, BFO distinguishes three families of objects informally, so this is not mandated in the ontology, but we distinguish organisms and object parts of organisms, such as cells and organs. Bones are a good example of objects. And then we distinguish material artifacts, like the pencil over there or this laptop. And then thirdly, we deal with lumps of matter, such as a rock or a lump of ice even would be counted as an object on this third criterion. In each case, we're dealing with objects which have their own boundaries, but the causality which holds them together and makes them into a unity is different. In the case of organisms, the causality is metabolism, biological interaction. In the case of artifacts, the causality might be electrical connection, or it might be screws holding parts together, or it might be just cleverly designed friction, as in the case of the pen. And then in the case of lumps of rock, it's chemical bonds which hold the entities together. Now, there may be other kinds of objects. We're not ruling that out. We need objects because one of the primary uses of BFO is to annotate biological data about things like populations, and populations are always populations of objects. Fiat object parts are things like arms. So my arm is not an object because it doesn't have its own continuous boundary. The boundary is the boundary of my whole body. But it's clear that there are arms. Arms are undetached parts of objects. Arms, heads, legs, table, tops, walls of rooms are all fiat object parts in the BFO term. And then object aggregates are groups or collections or sets of objects, and they only contain the objects which are their members as parts. So a population is an object aggregate. Then we have immaterial entities, which are basically wholes with an H plus boundaries. And we use the technical term site to cover various kinds of holes, cavities, dents, valleys, tunnels. All of these are sites from the BFO point of view. And your digestive tract is a site from the BFO point of view. The interior of a blood vessel is a site. Boundaries are, we call them Fiat boundaries. They are boundaries of material entities, and they are Fiat because when we look at them very carefully, we find that we're not dealing with a continuous boundary after all. We're dealing with a surface or a line or a point which looks as if it would be continuous in the case of a line or a surface, or infinitesimal in size in the case of a point. But in fact, they are abstractions which we make when we examine and perceive boundaries. The boundaries themselves are always some distance from being mathematically exact. But we need continuant Fiat boundaries. We even need mathematically exact continuant Fiat boundaries when we're dealing, for instance, with the top of a hole. I will give you some pictures of this in a minute, or the front of a cave. The entryway to a cave is a Fiat boundary of the cave, which is not a boundary of any material. And then we have different dimensions of Fiat boundary. And the happy hunting ground for boundaries in BFO is the FMA, which has all kinds of orifices and planes and junctions. And these are examples of either of Fiat boundaries or of sites in the FMA. And this is the example of the mathematically perfect Fiat boundary, which I referred to earlier. This is a two-dimensional Fiat boundary, which you penetrate very easily by walking into the cave. And I think I have another slide. Yes, here, this is the slide I want. So the cave itself is a site. The site has both physical boundaries around the material exterior and then a Fiat boundary where the entryway is. It's important that there is an entryway for the locations, the sites in which organisms live, because the organisms need to exit the site, the sites which are their habitats. Now we have an elucidation. We call it an elucidation because it's not really a definition, because we haven't formalized all the relations which are used in expressing it. It's provided in order to help you in understanding what sites are. So they are three-dimensional, they're not made of matter, and they're bounded partly or wholly by some material entity, or they are a three-dimensional part of something which is bounded partly or wholly by a material entity. And the reason why we say that is because there are some some sites, for instance, the site of Class A controlled airspace above every airport, which don't have any material boundaries. They are Fiat boundaries on all sides. And so we need this, or it is a three-dimensional immaterial part thereof, to cope with those kinds of cases. And the habitat of a buzzard flying in the sky, or the environment, or the niche of the spatial niche of a buzzard flying in the sky, is something like Class A controlled airspace. Now, when we have a case like this, we have in fact two holes. First of all, there is the larger hole, which is the site formed by the cave. But secondly, there is the smaller hole, which is a hole within that larger hole, which is the hole, which is a site in BFO terms, occupied by the bear. Now, that may not seem so intuitive if you think of a bear in a cave, but if you think of a fish in a body of water, when the fish is swimming through the water, it is continuously creating a hole which it occupies. And this double hole structure is needed if we're going to do justice to the locations of organisms in their environments. Now, once we understand sites and material entities, then we have a question: is Manhattan or Buffalo or Rochester a material entity or is it a site? And the answer is that in some contexts we use the word Manhattan to refer to a material entity, but in other cases we use it to refer to a site. When you live in Manhattan, you do not live inside the blocks of concrete which form the roads and streets in Manhattan. You live in the spaces between those blocks of concrete and the walls of the buildings, and both inside the buildings and outside the building. So this is going to be an important feature of describing environments, biological environments properly. We need to understand whether we're dealing with the environment as a site, for instance, a site on the surface of a rotting piece of cheese, or whether we're dealing with the piece of cheese itself as the place where the bacteria are growing. So we dealt with sites. Now, why do we need sites? Why can't we just make do with spatial regions? The answer is that sites move around while spatial regions stay stationary. So my digestive tract now is moving, but no spatial region in which I just occupied is moving, at least not moving relative to the frame of reference that we occupy when we are sitting in a lecture room like this. If we were in a spaceship moving very, very rapidly, then things would be different. So sites move because the material entities which are their hosts move. Now, I talked already about fiat boundaries. The word fiat was introduced to capture the fact that many of the boundaries that we have to deal with are not boundaries of a material sort. So this is a material boundary. It's what we call a bona fide boundary. It's a real boundary. We think of it as being a mathematical surface, but as I explained, when we examine it through a microscope, a very powerful microscope, we would see the mathematical surface to be actually a collection of very rapidly moving microparticles. But it's convenient to have a word for the surface that we see, and that would be a fiat boundary. Now, fiat boundaries are not only material boundaries like surfaces of tables, they are also, for instance, the boundaries between portions of real estate, or the boundaries between the left-hand side of this room and the right-hand side of this room, which is a surface running through the middle. That's a fiat boundary. And I will mention, although I will not discuss the fact that when we're dealing with disease phenomena, very often the distinction between healthy and diseased is a fiat boundary. So hypertension begins to exist at a certain threshold. Underneath that threshold, you don't have it. Above that threshold, you do have it. But that's a matter of fiat. It's not a physical distinction. And it changes, in fact. All right, so we've done this. Now, similarly, just as there are boundaries of material entities, so there are process boundaries. And I guess process boundaries are the beginning of a process or the end of a process or the threshold when the process reaches a certain benchmark. And physical process boundaries occupy zero-dimensional temporal regions. In other words, they occupy temporal points. Temporal regions themselves can be divided into not only zero-dimensional temporal regions, but one-dimensional regions, temporal regions, where spatial regions can be divided into 0, 1, 2, and 3-dimensional regions, because we have points, lines, surfaces, and volumes. And a process is always extended. So a process boundary occupies a point. A process boundary in BFO terms, is always extended across a temporal region of some duration. That's what distinguishes processes from process boundaries. And in some ontologies, the word event is used for a process boundary. In BFO, we don't do that. Now, some people argue that boundaries are dependent on the things they bound. So you never have a boundary unless you have a bounded thing, both in the time case and in the space case and in the material case. So you can't have the surface of a body without having the body. You can't have a volume. You can't have a point in space without having the surroundings of that point. And you can't have a point on a body without having the surrounding surface of that body. So is it not the case that boundaries are always dependent on bodies or on something which is of greater dimension than the boundary itself? And my answer is yes, but that doesn't mean that they are dependent in the same way in which specifically dependent continuants are dependent upon their bearers. Now, I don't want to go into too much detail about this. There is something called boundary dependence, which we have defined, and I can point out where the definition is, but it is a different kind of dependence from the dependence involved in specific dependence. The other question which arises often is whether we should include bona fide boundaries as well as fiat boundaries, and we have not yet seen a reason to do that. So using fiat boundaries, we have enough of a terminological vehicle to deal with all the kinds of boundaries we want to deal with without worrying about whether they are mere matters of fiat or whether they are physical. And then the other point which I need to make has to do with BFO for physicists. Physicists would not like talking about spatial regions or temporal regions except if a frame of reference is defined. And so when BFO is indeed overhauled for the purposes of use by physicists, we will need to develop the machinery for specifying frames of reference for defining spatial and temporal regions. Spatio-temporal regions, which BFO also includes, are frame independent, but space regions and time regions depend on the frame of reference you choose. For time, it may be the Gregorian calendar, for instance. For space, it may be latitude, longitude, or it may be just this room divided into components within which individuals in the room are located. Or it may be the frame of reference used to describe the planets or the galaxy. Each of those frames of reference defines a different collection of spatial, and this is an object aggregate. Now, object aggregates are a bit like sets, so you might think that this is just a set of 3 apples. But object aggregates can change their members and still remain the same object aggregate. So populations change their members regularly, but still they are the same population. And an organization like the IAOA has a population of members, but that population as an object aggregate in BFO terms remains the same even though its members change. And the rules for when a population or a family or a tribe or a species or a planetary system or any other example of a naturally occurring object aggregate, the rules for when they are the same object aggregate or when they are a different object aggregate are the rules determined by the relevant disciplines. So it's not up to BFO to determine when a family is the same family after 3 generations, or whether a family is the same family after 3 generations. Now, member part of is a relation between an object and an object aggregate. And now we're going to move on to qualities. So qualities are qualities of material entities. Qualities are, for instance, temperature, color, shape, mass, and so on. Another peculiarity of BFO is that your temperature stays the same even when it changes. And what this means is that your temperature is your temperature from the beginning to the end of your existence, and this temperature changes its value over time, but it's the same temperature, just as your height changes its value over time, but it's the same height, namely it's your height. So we're counting heights, and you don't get to have a new height every time you grow or shrink. It's always the same height. It's just cycling through different values. So John's temperature instantiates 37 degrees Celsius temperature at time t1. And it instantiates a different temperature at all of these other times. So when we create a temperature chart, we are creating a chart of somebody's temperature. as it changes. But it's always the same temperature, that person's temperature, which we are creating the chart for. All right, I think I'll break for questions now. Are there any? Yes?
The spatial region is fixed to a frame of reference.
Yes.
Can that frame vary? In other words, the center of the Earth, the center of the galaxy.
So if you take the 0 point of your frame of reference to be the center of the Earth, then that 0 point is treated as if it was at rest.
I'm struggling then a little bit how to distinguish sites from spatial regions. In that sense, if a site is fixed with respect, like the interior of my stomach, it's fixed with respect to me, then how do I distinguish that from a frame of reference, which is fixed to some other?
So if you're doing any kind of data gathering, you want to have a frame of reference that you can stick with through all your data gathering. Now, if you take 2 0 points, for instance, one 0 point is on a ship, and the other 0 point is the center of the Earth, you won't be able to gather data coherently about the things that you need to gather data for. So you choose. If you're only interested in the activities inside the ship, you can choose the center of the ship as your 0 point. But then you won't be able to say anything about how the ship moves around the Earth. So you choose a frame of reference which is sufficiently encompassing to do the job that you need to do in gathering your data. So you wouldn't choose a frame of reference which includes the whole galaxy. You might choose a frame of reference which gives you the center of the Earth as your 0. Or if you're doing a survey experiment in a jungle, for instance, you're observing snakes in a jungle, you divide the jungle into square regions. And you have the 0 point, which is the corner of the jungle, and then you cover the whole jungle with a lattice of square regions. Then you have a frame of reference, which is perfectly good for your experiment.
Okay. I guess what I was trying to get at is how do I decide in cases like that if I'm dealing with instances of sites or instances of spatial regions?
So, you're not going to be gathering data about those squares which you've created in the space occupied by the jungle, because you have specified those squares. You don't need to examine them, see them, you've defined them. And the frame of reference is what you define. You don't gather data about your frame of reference. You use it as a way of formatting or formulating your data. You do gather data about sites. You want to know what is the sleeping site of the snakes, and what is the mating site of the snakes, and so on.
Okay, so I think that helps. Yeah.
Any more? Yes.
This is related to my work last year, but I'll phrase it differently in a different somewhat sense. Regarding qualities, how do we talk about the sodium level in a portion of blood? Is that a quality?
So the main criterion for identifying whether you have a quality or not is whether it's there, present, without anything needing to happen, so that you can measure it. You can just go and measure it. Now, I think the sodium level is just there. You can go and measure it. You can measure it at any time. As contrasted with what we call realizables, which we will be dealing with in a few minutes, which are not there unless they are triggered or realized or manifested or performed. So that's how you know whether something is a quality. And if you just think of, we can just measure it as being a rough and ready criterion for whether you're dealing with a quality. Yep.
I have a question about the time when you said the measurement is, or I'm sorry, the temperature. When you said a measurement is an instance of that temperature, but isn't that
No, I didn't. If I said that, that was a mistake.
Okay. So
we can measure the temperature at time t1 and get the value 37 degrees Celsius.
Right.
We could write that value down in a temperature chart. I'm coming back to that issue when we talk about the IAO.
Right, because
there shouldn't really be any numbers here, because these are the real temperatures in reality, and reality doesn't have 31 degrees Celsius. That's a social construction that we invented.
So the relationship there would be something like references, temperature, or like...
There will be a reference from, you'll see this slide later on, actually the information artifacts are out here.
Yeah.
So the information artifacts over here point to this and say, measured as 37.3 degrees Celsius. And this is just a special temperature value which John has at this time.
Right.
But until we measure it, we don't know.
Right.
And until we decide on a scale of temperature to use, we don't know what precisely is the subclass of the superclass temperature that we're dealing with. So that it's an interesting question whether there were entities which were 37.3 degrees Celsius before Celsius invented the Celsius temperature scale. On the one hand, obviously yes, but on the other hand, no, there weren't. The scale wasn't invented. All right, so histories.
Barry, can I just ask a question about aggregates? Aggregates don't have to all have members that are all of the same type, do they?
No, they are the easy and common ones, but for the aggregate of parts of your watch, for instance, when you take it apart, or even when you keep it not taken apart, is an aggregate of heterogeneous parts.
Okay, so that's okay to have a...
Now, if it's not an aggregate of all the parts in your watch, however, because the gaps, the holes, the containing places where the wheels and so forth go, they are also parts of your watch. Your watch wouldn't work without the holes inside it, with an H. Just as your body wouldn't work without the cavities.
So the immaterial parts of my watch are not part of the aggregate of parts?
No, no. And you destroy them when you take the watch apart. You destroy them and you just lay the material parts out in front of you, and then you put them all back together and thereby recreate the housing.
Right. Yeah.
If you have like a collection of coordinates that describe the surface of an object, is that a Fiat boundary?
I would say that you have created a system of Fiat boundaries.
Okay.
And that's what we do when we create small globes and draw the lines of latitude and longitude. We're creating Fiat boundaries.
And if you put that model into like a computer and you had, you know, a three-dimensional image of, like, say, a protein or a bone or something, is that the same Fiat boundary, or is it some sort of boundary produced by like the simulation? Or
so the topic of modeling and simulation is a topic which BFO still needs to address in detail. But for the moment, what I will say, and I will even talk about that in a little while, is that the information artifact you've created in the computer is about the system of Fiat boundaries that you've created on the side of the object. So I guess the typical case would be that you examine a protein through an electron microscope. You use your computer to create Fiat boundaries in the image that you could see on the computer. So the Fiat boundaries are generated by the computer, but you see them as being as if they were boundaries on the protein, because that's what your image shows. So I don't think that that's a case of modeling. I think it's more a case of making a visual representation of the protein itself.
Okay, but I guess maybe so would that apply for like a visual representation of a baseball? Because it's a little like the models they get from proteins are aggregates, so they're solved structures. So it's not really like...
Okay, well then the story, I was thinking just of a static image. If you're thinking of a solved structure, that's another story. There you are dealing with a model.
Okay, so I guess maybe we can look at this later, but I've been thinking about that problem, and I don't really know if I completely understand what you mean there. So I'll ask you later.
So when you don't understand what I mean about which particular topic, the frame of reference or the Fiat boundary?
I'll get back to you.
Hmm?
I'll get back to you.
Okay.
Can you have an object aggregate of one entity?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think probably not. But you can think of cases where you might be forced to say that you have an object aggregate with just one member. So if you define organization as an object aggregate which such and such, then and I think that's an attractive way to define organization, then if all but one of the members of that aggregate dies, but the organization survives, as is proved by the fact that it's still registered in the New York State Registry of Organizations, then you would have to accept, you either have to give up your definition or accept a one-member aggregate. And that's the kind of thing that keeps me awake.
Yeah, an example would be if you were taking, you had some spreadsheet with all the information about how many students were in classes, and you want to say, okay, that's the student body. Students in this class is an object aggregate.
Yeah.
And then you have an independent study with one student, and you go, okay.
Yeah, we really have to take those
populations
kinds of problems seriously.
This is something that kept me occupied for a while.
So words like population, organization, family, even, all seem to suggest multiple object aggregates. But there are borderline cases where you would have a one-person family or a one-person population. There will one day be only one human being left. And maybe few people will die simultaneously, but it's likely that they won't die simultaneously. Come at the end of the world. Anyway. So we introduced the term history to mean the sum of the process. It's another word for life. It's the sum of the processes taking place in the interior, or in the spatial temporal region occupied by a material entity. So it includes all the vibrations of the larynx when a human speaks, all the movements of the arms, all the metabolism, all the neutrinos passing through the body, even during the time when they are in the spatial temporal region occupied by the body. It's something which is defined for specific formal purposes. We need it in order to do certain things with the ontology. And it's quite intuitive. The only semi-intuitive part is that the things which happen inside your ears are also parts of your history. So we take the topological closure of all the cavities. So inside your mouth counts as part of you, and so on. And that would be, that is, from a biological point of view, not quite right. But from a point of view of a general principle for having processes which capture everything which happens in the life of an object, whether it's a biological object or a material object, we need to have it be that way. So the idea is that every material entity has exactly one history, which is the total history of everything which happens within the spatial temporal region it occupies, and every history is the history of exactly one material object. One material entity. So this is a way of having a one-to-one correspondence between material entities on the continuance side and processes, because histories are processes on the occurrence side. And so the history of two material entities is the sum of the histories of its entities taken seriously, and so on, taken separately. All right, so we saw how temperature changes over time. Diseases change over time. And we can track diseases as they evolve, just as we can track temperatures as they move through different values. So this is how heart disease evolves. We start with early lesions, small plaques, and then we have silent infarction, and then we have disruptions of plaque, and then we have unstable angina, and then we have stable angina. And these follow each other in this sequence. And we read this picture in exactly the same way that we read the temperature picture. This is a subtype of coronary heart. So it's a phase, or it's present in a series of phases, but it's a continuant type which has instances. For instance, your heart disease or his heart disease. And it's a subtype of another continuant type called coronary heart disease. And we'll be talking much more about the ontology of disease later on. Here I'm interested in you understanding the difference between the way time works for instances and the way time works for universe. And that just repeats what I just said. Now we'll move it slightly together. So John is an organism, John's temperature is a quality. John is an instance, John's temperature is an instance. And those things are all continuous. So John's temperature continues to exist for exactly the time when John continues to exist. These things are occurrence, they occur. So John's temperature corresponds to the course of John's temperature over time, which is an instance of the kind course of temperature changes, which is itself a process, which is an occurrence. And similarly for John's life is an instance of the type life of an organism, which is an instance of process, which is a subtype of process, which is a subtype of occurrence. And then if we have functions, the function of John's eye is to see. That is an instance of the type to see, which is a subtype of function, which is a subtype of dependent continuant. And then a process of seeing in John is an instance of the type process of seeing, which is a realization of the function of John's eye to see. And now we see here that there are qualities, and the qualities are qualities of things like organisms or lumps of matter or buildings or planets. So we're using quality always to talk about the quality of some material entity. We may be able to extend it to things like shapes. So, but then the shape of this screen here, that would still be a quality of a material entity. So BFO in fact restricts the use of quality so that qualities are there are only qualities of independent continuance. Now, BFO is not loved by everybody. It's not loved even by all the people who use it. And one of the main reasons why BFO users complain is because they would like to have in BFO a term which they could use for qualities of processes. So if we have a body and the body has a temperature, we can use the quality term in BFO as the upper level term for organizing our data about John's temperature. Now similarly, John has various processes going on in his life. He has bouts of depression, for instance. He has coughings, fits. He has suicidal behaviors. And these will be either continuous or long-lasting or interrupted or surprising or regrettable and so on. And people say these are all qualities of processes. Qualities of John's suicidal behavior is that it's continuous or that it's stopped. And so why can't we have qualities of processes in BFO? Well, the answer is that you can have qualities of processes in the sense that you can create terms which are BFO conformant or referring to qualities of processes. But they are not terms describing extra entities. They are terms which describe what a week ago I called defined classes. Now I'll give you the lesson again, and it's kind of a religious lesson. If you have three apples in a bowl, then you don't have four things, namely the three apples plus the number 3 in the bowl. Talking about 3 apples in the bowl is talking about 3 apples. It's not talking about 3 apples plus the number 3. The number 3 is not something extra there. There is a threeness there. It's not an extra thing. It's already given to you when you have the three law. Now similarly, but that's not the case with temperature. If John has a temperature, it may be a temperature of a different value on one day from the next, and we need to be able to capture that difference. Also, John, if we have something like John's function of being, John's role of being the director of the institute, John can still exist without having that role, and so we need the role, because John's existing doesn't tell us that the role exists. The three apples existing tells us that the threeness exists. So there are some entities which we need to keep track of, roles, qualities, and so forth, because they change independently of their bearers. But then we don't need to keep track of certain other entities, because once we have the bearers, the other entities are there anyway. As soon as we have three apples, we also have three. That wasn't a very convincing lesson, but anyway, it's a step in the right direction. Now, let's suppose that we have a process of a heart beating. And let's suppose that this process is of a heart beating at 6 beats per minute. Let's say 60 beats per minute. Now, that process is a process of 60 beats per minute. It couldn't have been a process of 70 beats per minute, because that would have been a different process. So once you have your hands on that process, you also have your hands on a 60 beat per minute process. In other words, the process doesn't have the extra entity called quality of being 60 beats per minute. Rather, the process is an instance of the kind 60 beats per minute heart beating process. Now, if you have a rabbit, that's an instance of the kind rabbit. You don't need also to have the rabbitness quality. So that in order to make a rabbit into an instance of the kind rabbit, you need also rabbitness. That's redundant, because if it's a rabbit, we already know that it's an instance of the kind rabbit. And similarly, if it's a 60 beats per minute heartbeat process, then it's an instance of the kind 60 beat per minute heartbeat process. Are you sort of with me? All right, that's it's to warm you up. Now I will go through a fuller version of the story. So let me just check that I have the right.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Where does an algorithm, like the algorithm itself,
That's coming
fit
in part 2. That's IA, the information artifact.
Okay. Okay.
All right, so forget the lesson for a minute, and we'll start the story again from the very beginning. So the computer science grew out of logic. Logic was invented at the end of the 19th century by a mathematician called Frege, and by a philosopher called Russell, and by various contemporaries. And logic turned out to be a very crucial tool in the creation of modern computers. The logic that Frege and Russell invented is called first-order logic. And I mentioned common logic earlier. Common logic is just a standardized version of first-order logic. First-order logic is fantastically useful for formalizing information in a structured way. But it's not so useful for computing purposes, because you can't guarantee that it will execute in the way that you more or less can with something like OWL. But first-order logic is still very important. OWL itself is a sub-theory of first-order logic. Now, the reason why I mention it is because the origin of modern ontology, which is roughly speaking in the 1970s in Stanford, was in a group of AI scientists at Stanford who wanted to formalize human knowledge. They wanted to formalize human knowledge for the sake of building robots which could behave like human beings by having the formal equivalent of human knowledge in their robot brains. So the original ontologies, including, for instance, Patrick Hayes' ontology for liquids, the very first ontologies in the sense that we are talking about in this class, were built using first-order logic. Now, they were built in a very special way. It happens to be the way which was standard in philosophy for 100 years. So it looks to us very special, for reasons which will become clear in a minute. But it didn't seem to them very special because that was what everyone did. And what they did was they said there is only one kind of predication. We have predicates and we have objects. And if we want to predicate anything of the object, we have to put the name of the object in small letters, in brackets, and then we put the predicate in big letters, and we say the predicate holds of the object. So the predicate is a man holds of John, the predicate has a headache holds of John, the predicate is sleepy holds of John, the predicate is a mammal holds of John. They're all the same, they're all F of A. This is just the way first order logic was used to codify human knowledge and scientific knowledge. So this is the standard philosopher's ontology. I call it phantology. As we saw a week ago, there are more ways of predicating. In this way, we can say John instantiates the universal man. John's influenza instantiates the universal influenza. And that is different from the manner allowed by the standard reading of form. Now, John has a headache, we can read in the standard reading. John is the object and the predicate is has a headache. There is no headache here, there is just a predicate, has a headache, which is like the predicate is blue. And then there is a third kind, and what this says is the object has a quality. So with three ways. The object is predicated by the has a headache predicate, which doesn't mention headaches at all. It certainly doesn't mention any specific headache. The object is characterized by having this particular headache, which mentions an instance of the kind headache, and then the object is instantiating a universal or a kind or a class, which is, for instance, the class human or the class mammal or the class animal or the class object. This was codified by Aristotle a long, long ago. So we have John has this headache, John has a headache, John is a man. And this was in turn then codified by a contemporary philosopher called E.J. Lowe, one of the best ontologists of the philosophical sort in the 20th century, in this book called The Four-Category Ontology, a metaphysical foundation for natural science. And it was just a defense of a view very much like the one Aristotle laid out. But now BFO comes along and says, we need more than 4, we need 6. We need independent continuance, dependent continuance, and processes. And we need universals for all of these things also. That makes 6. We need processes, but we also need the objects which participate in those processes. And we also need the qualities of those objects which we measure. We need at least this much to do medical informatics. Now, as it happens, part of this wasn't anticipated. There was one rebel in the philosophical world who was an influential critic of the one way of predicating. He said, we also need to have events in our ontology. So what BFO does is a similar move to what Davidson did, although we do it in a more beautifully regular way. But now somebody could come. Ellis is an Australian ontologist who also had this 6-category ontology. Why not 8? So there are people who say, well, if you're going to have object qualities as well as objects, why not have process qualities as well as processes? Now, this now comes the lesson again. We don't need process qualities. What we need to do is to define the predication that we are attempting to formulate when we think that we need a process quality. So if we have a 6 beat per minute heartbeat, that means we have a process which can be divided into 6 equal parts, each one of which is a beat in every minute. That's what we mean. It doesn't mean that the process has an extra thing, an extra entity attached to it called a 6 beat per minute entity, like a temperature entity or a role as employer entity, it means that it has a certain structure. It is structured in a certain way. It's an instance of the kind process structured in a 6 beat per minute way. So that's the end of the lesson. That's the reason why BFO doesn't have process qualities. We can do the job which people want to do by process qualities more effectively by having defined classes. And at some stage, we will, Werner and I will show you how to document defined classes. And how, once you've defined them, you can use them in just the same way that you use any other class within BFO. That's what I mean when I said that you can have process qualities in BFO. You just have to document them in the right way. And you have to avoid supposing that they are extra entities in the way the 8-category ontology proposal might make you think. When we look at what happens when a measurement is taken of a process, then we have various elements. A measurement datum. We have an assay. It has a participant, a device. The device has a screen as part. A certain quality inheres in this screen, namely the readout of 120 beats per minute. It's about a certain process, namely John's heart beating. Most data about process qualities is actually measurement data. The assay, namely measuring heart rate, has a specified output, which is a measurement datum, and it has as participant an organism and a device. So the device is applied to the organism to get the readout. So we have the problem of process qualities. This is how we solve the problem, by being very careful how we deal with measurement data. Having been cleansed in the waters of the Ganges is not a quality that something has. To say it, John has been cleansed in the waters of the Ganges, is really just a way of saying that a long time ago he bathed appropriately in the waters of the Ganges. It's something about the history of John, not about the quality of John. And similarly, if you say that John is older than 40 years of age, you're not saying that there's something extra about John, mainly the 40 years of age quality. You're just describing, actually, the event. You're saying something about the event of John's birth, namely that that event was more than 40 years old. And if you look at the way BFO is used, that's the way we formalize age information, by using the birth of the participant as a benchmark, since that never changes. The date of the birth of the participant is always the same. And if you use the date of the birth of the participant plus today's date, you can always work out the age without having to say what the age is. You always have the information you need. And similarly, X is the brother of a former smoker. That's not a quality of X. Now you're saying something about X's relations to other things, but you're not saying something about X. You're not saying something which is an extra entity in the world in the way that X's temperature was an extra entity. And similarly, if X is registered to vote in Leipzig, that is not a quality of X. That is information about a certain registry and about a certain event of registering in which John participated. So again, it's information about the past of John. Now, how do we use defined classes in order to define qualities of processes? In order to say that a process has a 60 beats per minute pseudo quality, we just need to provide a definition. The definition I already gave you. We can decompose the process into sub-processes which are homogeneous, each of which is 1 beat, and there are n or 60 or however many such processes in any given minute. That's what we mean by beats per minute and by 60 beats per minute. That's the way in which we capture P is a 60 beat per minute process, by saying that P is an instance of this defined class, and the defined class is defined here. Process P has rate R is analogous not to rabbit R has weight W, but rather to rabbit R is an instance of the universal rabbit. That's why we have a 6-category ontology rather than an 8-category ontology, as we see here. Now we talk a little bit more about qualities. An entity like an organism, it passes through life and changes along various dimensions. And qualities in the BFO sense are pretty much those dimensions. So temperature is a dimension of variation, height is a dimension of variation, mass or weight is a dimension of variation, and so on. So the bearer of all of those qualities remains the same, but the bearer cycles through different values of each of those qualities from time to time. In order to understand that, we need to understand the distinction between determinable qualities and determinate qualities. Temperature, blood pressure, mass are determinable qualities. What that means is that they have determinate values. They get determined always in some determinate way. So every determinable quality exists only in some determinate value. And this is how it looks. So John's temperature is rising, and as it rises, it cycles through infinitely many values, or at least a lot of values, each of which we are articulating as a subclass, a determinate subclass of the determinable quality class called temperature. And so we've said that. So in some literatures, these are called physiology variables. And the idea is that if we understand all the physiology variables affecting a given organism, then we can understand what combination of physiology variables goes hand in hand with what different sorts of diseases, for instance, that the organism may be suffering from. So we've seen heart disease, and now the course of John's heart disease. We're moving slowly towards what we will need for OGMs later on. So John, again, is an instance of organism. His heart disease is an instance of the class heart disease. And that heart disease is like John's temperature. It goes through different values through time. So there is a course of John's heart disease. In many treatments of disease within the medical literature, the author will move in talking about disease between talking about the disease itself, which is a continuant, which endures through time, to talking about the disease's unfolding, the process of going through the symptoms. Now, BFO forces you to distinguish very clearly between the disease itself and the disease course. And I can give you an argument why we need both. Why we can't get away with just with talking about either one or the other in due course. But first of all, we need to say more about some other matters. So, roles I introduced earlier. I will emphasize one or 2 points about roles for present purposes. So if you have a role, that means that you've been ascribed a role in some social context. You've been hired, you've been registered as a student, you've been charged with a crime, you've been promoted. In each case, you don't change. What changes is your social standing. Somebody checks a box and signs a document. As soon as you get the new role, you are likely to change because the new role will force you to engage in new kinds of activities. But they are not, those activities do not amount to the role. In other words, you have the role even when you're not performing the activities. And this is the first example of a realizable. A role is a realizable. You have it even when you're not realizing it. It's a realizable. Qualities you just have. You always have a temperature, even when no one's measuring it. Roles you also just have, but you only manifest them in very special circumstances. During the daytime, when you're in your place of employment, when it's not break, and when you're actually supposed to be doing something. That's when you realize your role. But you still have it even if you're not realizing it. And you can lose it. So roles are always optional. Roles often come in systems. So you are the employee because you have an employer, your employee role and your employer role are mutually dependent upon each other. Each requires the other in order to exist. And the same goes for hosts and pathogens. A pathogen is a pathogen only if there is a host. Otherwise, it's just a bacterium or a virus. Same goes for food. A biological substance has the food role, but it can lose the food role if people suddenly decide that they don't want to eat meat anymore. Then, who would ever decide that? Then certain kinds of biological substances which did have the food role now no longer have the food role. All right, or the drug role, indeed. Drugs are only drugs if they're packaged and available for administration. So we have the drug role here, and the realization of the drug role, for instance, in the form of John's taking the drug in question. I just want to conclude this part by describing why BFO is chosen by so many groups as the top-level ontology for their ontology work. So there are, as I mentioned already, other top-level ontologies. Dolce is the most important. And there are maybe a dozen groups who use Dolce. But there are more than 300 groups who are using BFO. And the reasons go like this. So this is the beginning of the list. You can find it at the BFO website. So in order to be a successful top-level ontology, you need to be small, because you need to be used over and over again by different domains, which means you need to teach it to different domains, and they're not going to learn something which is incredibly complicated. It has to be in the public domain, so completely free to anybody to use for any purpose. And it has to be a true top-level ontology, which means it doesn't have any domain content inside it. It doesn't have anything about diseases or measurements or people or anything. It's just object, process, continuant, occurrent. And you see, BFO satisfies all three of those. Sumo has a top level as part, but it's much bigger than a top-level ontology because it has lots of other things as part. Sumo is not small, as you will see if you look at it. Dolce is doing well. Dolce is small, it's open, it's it's a true top level, pretty much. And there are other proposed top-level ontologies over there, which I'm not going to talk about. Well, Highfleet, the company went bankrupt, so it really lost the race. The next feature that a good top-level ontology must have is good documentation. And documentation both for users and technical documentation for the people who implement ontologies using BFO. And again, BFO does very well along both of those criteria. Dolce, and Sumo too, incidentally. Sumo has good documentation. And then you have to have help desk. You have to have reviewers. You have to people who criticize, people who find mistakes in the ontology, people who point out new ways of using it. And so we have that. We have 150 people who are part of the BFO user group, and we provide lots of support, which is a pain in the neck. And Dolce has provided support for people building ontologies, but no support at all for users. They don't care about users. And then, what else do you need? Well, you need good natural language definitions. You need good word net mapping, which we now have something like that. It needs to be stable, and it needs to have a proper license so that people can trust that it is in the public domain, that they can do anything they want with it. Now, as you see, BFO has all of those things. And where any other candidate falls short in multiple ways.